Is there a strategy that'll help you grow your company faster? CEO Sales Strategies is an investigative business podcast for entrepreneurial people who never stop asking questions. Highly acclaimed sales revenue growth expert Doug C. Brown interviews CEOs, business owners, and professionals who serve them to uncover and share actionable tips and methods behind their bulletproof sales strategies. Topics covered on the show include their failures, struggles, secrets, and processes that help them succeed in selling millions to billions of dollars of their products and services, all with the sole aim of helping you grow your business. If you are eager to know the most effective sales secrets from the A players of the game, then the CEO Sales Strategies podcast is certainly the place to be.
Hey everyone, this is Doug C. Brown with the CEO Sales Strategies podcast, bringing you another amazing guest. His name is Dr. Christopher Croner, and he owns a company called SalesDrive. Brought him on because Chris really focuses in on what is a high-performing salesperson and how do you find them, retain them, hire them, how do you do it the right way? There are a lot of characteristics around this. You know, I've talked about this subject in the past. A lot of people are still asking questions. How do I do this? How do I do this right? How do I do it safely? How do I do this and actually make it work? You know, and what am I supposed to look for? And more importantly, what am I not supposed to do? So without further ado, let's go talk to Chris and let's find out. Hey, Chris, welcome to the CEO Sales Strategies podcast. I'm really grateful you're here.
Doug, thank you so much for having me. Look forward to being of service today.
We have a topic of choice, which is always near and dear to my heart, which is how do you hire top performing salespeople? And more importantly, how do you do it the right way? And you wrote a book on this, and the book's really cool. It's called Never Hire a Bad Salesperson Again by Dr. Christopher Croner. And folks, I recommend the book. This is the second edition of the book. So go out and get the book. And it's really cool. So let's dive right in. What is a top performing salesperson versus just a top performer, if you will? Like, what's the pinnacle of the A player versus the average top producer?
Good question. You know, everything's relative to a given company, of course, but it's sort of a distinction where people know that person when they see them. You know, the person that really goes above and beyond. It's the mentality of that kid in school that just has to get an A. The person who's constantly focused on setting the bar high, if you will, jumping over that, setting it higher again the next time. They're not satisfied with any given level of production. They always want to exceed that level of production. So there are many salespeople who get up to a certain pinnacle and then they plateau at that pinnacle because that's satisfying to them. But someone who is a top performer, as we define it, who has that non-teachable drive characteristic, those three elements, they're constantly thinking about what can they do to surpass their previous performance. So the key distinction is wherever you see them at now, you're going to see them higher next month, higher the following month, or higher the following year, again and again. So they're constantly climbing, if you will. That's the key distinction.
So why do people get satiated or satisfied in sales? Because you know, in most sales, you can have a compensation plan that's unlimited, right? I mean, somebody can earn $50 million on their compensation plan, but then they kind of get stuck and they stop there. Why do they do that?
Great question. You know, in many cases, people start out with a goal in mind. They have a goal in mind for what they want to do in terms of how much money they want to make, how successful they want to be, etc. They then go from that point to their sales career. And at some point, they reach that goal. They've reached that level. They work very, very hard to reach that level. At that point, now they've satisfied those things. On the other side, you can have individuals that have a lot of pressures, external pressures on them. We have companies who have come to us frustrated, said, you know, we really look for candidates with a lot of external pressures. Somebody who has, say, a mortgage, a couple car payments, kids in school. Well, again, those external pressures also very motivating. But eventually, a person gets up to a certain level, and that level of external pressure is now relieved. Now they know what they need to, quote unquote, phone in quarter after quarter just to maintain. And that's what they do. They maintain. So they get up to a level of production that satisfies themselves, and then they just maintain it. Whereas the person motivated by, again, the characteristics that we'll talk about today, particularly need for achievement, they'll continue to excel. They'll continue to produce. Money is still important to them, but they look at money the same way that, say, a great athlete looks at points on the scoreboard. It's how they show how well they've done rather than their goal in and of itself.
So a player or a high performing top player, they don't have to be motivated. They're already motivated intrinsically from birth or whenever on.
Exactly. Sort of a combination of nature and nurture, if you will. There's the way the person is wired. You know, at birth, there's a trait that psychologists call conscientiousness. A facet of that is achievement striving, if you will. And then there's the way the person is raised. Typically, the person who ends up having a high need for achievement is held accountable in some way for their behavior during their childhood. It could be many different things. It could be academic performance. It could be performance athletically. Maybe they're watching their brothers and sisters. They could be in a band. Whatever it is, they're held accountable. Those two things together, nature and nurture, by the time the person's in their late teens, early 20s, that characteristic is relatively solidified.
So we're looking for the nature and nurture characteristics, opposed to, hey, this person's likable, this person might be able to sell, or they have a track record of selling. We're still looking for those two characteristics, which is an indicator of this person's never going to be satisfied no matter where they're at. They're just as a top athlete, they want to be Michael Jordan. They want to be out there. They're going to practice early. They're going to leave late. They're going to run more drills than other people. They're going to make more phone calls. They're going to make more relationships. They're going to do whatever they have to do to actually be at the top.
Yes, exactly. And that's that key distinction is when we talk about practice, there are the characteristics that are teachable and those that are not teachable. So on the teachable side, many people think they're looking for a salesperson who just has sort of the gift of gab and enjoys persuasion and just likes people. But you can teach someone persuasion. You can teach someone relationship skills. Past the age of 21, 22, you cannot change drive. Either it's there or it's not. And again, it's that Michael Jordan mentality, that person who is practicing the things that they can practice, but intrinsically, they've got those non-teachable pieces that compel them to do that.
It's very interesting because when I think back to my sales career, I was always the one at number one. If I was number two, it drove me nuts, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I didn't really think about it in that capacity because I was just doing what I naturally would do in the first place. So I haven't taken your assessment yet, which I know you spend a lot of time painstakingly putting together, and I will take that. I'm wondering if I'm I suspect I am that type of person. I've always felt I was, right? So, and all the people that I hang around with, we meet each other, by basically going, hey, it's good to see you. By the way, I'm better than you. Do you know that? Right. So some people would think that's arrogance, but it's really not. It's one of those things that this is how we think.
Yep. It's the way the person's wired. So it's like that Netflix special on Michael Jordan, the person that is always looking at the people around them, that provides sort of a background to say, okay, here's the level they are. Now I want to measure myself in relation to that. That's that competitiveness. When you add that competitiveness to that achievement striving, the person who simply wants to do well for its own sake, that's when you've got the deadly combination, if you will, the person that just has to have their victory, has to win, has to compare themselves to the team, and must come out on top. And again, a concern we'll often get then is, well, is this person going to be the bull in the china shop, if you will?
Right.
They're going to be too excessively competitive. Well, that's why we also look at the need for achievement. It moderates that, if you will. So the person with the high need for achievement, again, they're like the kid in school that just has to get an A. So we've had many sales managers who will tell us, I'd much rather have somebody that I can pull back rather than someone I need to push. And that person who has that high need for achievement wants to do well for its own sake, and they will adjust their behavior if for any reason there's something they're doing that potentially is getting in their own way.
Makes a lot of sense. And so I know when I managed many sales teams over my life, we would get those people who get saturated, right? They'd come in, they'd get at, 300, 350 or whatever on the thing. And they're like, it's more money than they needed. Everybody's taken care of. And so they kind of kick back and relax and kind of do that. And this may not sound really great, but I mean, one of the techniques in getting those people motivated is you have them go out and buy a new expensive car. Mm-hmm. Or a boat, or take, whatever, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, geez, I need an extra $35,000. So they get back out producing again.
Yep. Exactly. And that's, as I mentioned, when you put the person under the gun in some way that can simulate, some of that achievement striving, because now they have a pressure, they have an external pressure that's motivating them. And that's fantastic. But eventually, of course, again, the pressure's relieved. And now you got to think, okay, what's the next thing? What's the next thing we can get them to go out and buy?
Let's go out and get them a new condo.
Guess what you just bought today?
So it's not that they're arrogant, because I have this conversation a lot with people on and around hiring, because, I've hired hundreds, if not over 1,000 people in sales in my life. And I constantly have this conversation. They think, well, these top producers like that, they're going to be the most arrogant and disruptive, as you said. I think that was the word you used, disruptive to the organization. But if they're truly an overachiever, if they're truly that personality and they have all these traits that you're talking about, they're actually going to be some of the easiest employees to actually employ and keep happy. And they're going to keep your people happy as well as your clients, because they don't want to disrupt the whole process. That's been my understanding. Is that your understanding as well?
Of course. And again, it's important, though, that we understand the proper care and feeding, if you will, for this type of an individual. Talk about the environment. And the environment for any company really has to be ready to have that high performing hunter. There's all the elements of what we can think of as the ecosystem of sales. There's fit with the company culture, which is really important, fit with the management style, fit with the compensation plan. All those things come together at the end of the day, like an athlete, to ultimately determine how successful that person will be. In this case, when we're talking about personality, we're talking about raw athletic ability. How fast can they run? How high can they jump? So if you have somebody with that high need for achievement, we have to make sure that we're giving them the environment in which that person can naturally thrive. So as you talked about at the beginning, we're not putting any limits on what they can do production-wise, but we're also recognizing what's most important to that person is to be recognized, to feel that significance, if you will, that they have the opportunity to be significant, that we give them those kudos when they are successful, the awards and so forth. That's how they know how well they've done, if you will. So as long as the environment is conducive to the person doing well, yeah, that is the absolute perfect scenario, and they will do well, particularly in situations now where people can't be monitored all the time, where we have people working more remotely.
Right.
You're not always over someone's shoulder. That entrepreneurial mindset, if you will, that's what we look for.
So I think there's a myth, a fallacy, if you will, that some of these people, people listening are going to be thinking, well, my gosh, if they're such high performers, they don't want training. They don't need that type of stuff, right? And so I can just kind of hire somebody, put them in play, and they'll just kind of go out and do their own thing. I know that not to be true. What's been your experience in this too?
That's a very good point. That's one of the challenges companies have is they'll hear about the drive model. Okay, this sounds great. Let's get a high drive salesperson, throw them to the wolves. They should be able to handle it themselves. Well, particularly if someone is earlier in career, they still need that help. They still need to know the right things to do. Yes, they might not necessarily like training if they're a bit later in career and they find that training is meaningless to them because they already have that knowledge. They're mercenary with their time, to be sure, but they're still going to need some care and feeding. They're still going to need to be managed correctly to be successful. As we talk about in the book, having that mission meeting with that person during the first week, really making sure that we're aligned. Not only that person understands the goals of the company, but that the company is expressing to them that they understand what's most important to that person and they're bonded with that manager. So that, again, their goals are very much in line. When you accomplish those steps, particularly during the first 30, 60, 90 days, you really set that person up for success. And yes, you can kind of let them go, if you will, because they're going to want to do well for its own sake. Of course, needing to circle back to them regularly to kind of give them the extra support they need, making sure the environment is ready for that high performer, that it's supportive of that. It's supportive of the individual who's high in need for achievement.
So I think it's important then if we're going to look as a company, if a company's going to look and they want these, high performing players on their sales team, to first probably ask themselves the question, are you an A-player company? Are you set up for this? Because I know myself and every one of my high performing friends, if the company's not set up, we'll do one of two things. A, quit. Because we got 5 other offers already on the table, usually. I'm not trying to be arrogant. I'm just trying to give the personality profile of real life, right?
Yep.
Or B, we'll start innovating and making it all up and make it happen anyways. And that might be disruptive to the organization more so. Like we'll sell stuff you don't even have and then force operations to kind of, put it in play. So,
yep.
What can a company do to, sort of look at this and say, okay, I'm going to get ready for these people. I should have these things in place.
Good question. In many cases, it's sort of a philosophical gut check. Getting ready for bringing those sorts of individuals on board. Is the philosophy of the company ready for that? Are they ready for, bringing someone on board who has that desire to achieve? It's easy to say, oh, sure, we are. But are you ready for those salespeople that have that need for achievement, understanding what that really means? Competitiveness, those people who really want to be their best. Optimism, they're certain they're going to succeed. They're resilient. When you have that person on board, okay, that they're sort of like that high performance sports car. Are you ready now to be able to drive, with that sort of a car? And then making sure that all the other functions within the company are going to be supportive of that person, just as you said. Is operations going to be supportive of that person? If the person is working in manufacturing, is manufacturing going to be supportive of that person? Because they're going to be operating at a very high level. Are all the other functions of the company are they going to be able to support them effectively? So really kind of doing that psychological, philosophical gut check, and then looking at all the functions of the company. Are they going to be supportive to every action, everything that you have on the job description for that salesperson to do successfully? If that person does set the bar high, if they do really jump over it, if they do set it higher again, are you going to be able to support them, be able to answer a yes to all of those questions?
That's a really good point, because just like in a high performance car, you can take that thing into the corner at 190 miles an hour, but you don't have the track right. Yep. You're going to end up in the stands basically with that vehicle. So it's and I've noticed this, and I started measuring this and looking at statistics and stuff. And you may have the more current statistics, but it was like something like 70% of these type of players will leave a job within 90 days if and only if they deem it to be misrepresented on the front end. So they look at it and they say, well, this wasn't part of the gig. This wasn't part of the deal. That wasn't part of the deal. Why didn't you, express that? So shouldn't companies express that right up front? Hey, we got some issues here. Operations, we're revamping operations, but so things are going to slow down a little bit here, and you run into this and you run into that. I've never found that to be an impediment with these type of people, as long as they know up front. How about you?
Very, very good point. Setting reasonable expectations is really important during the interview process, making sure that the candidate is well aware of all the challenges the company has and the opportunities that gives the candidate. One way that you can frame that, if you're still kind of developing or still kind of growing some areas of the company, is looking at it as an opportunity. How is this an opportunity for that candidate? What can they contribute here because of these unique challenges that we're continuing to improve upon? How is this in some way an opportunity that they can get with us that they couldn't get anywhere else? And really kind of reframing it in that way. That can be an effective way to kind of eat your cake and have it too in that regard. Makes
a lot of sense. We're talking with Dr. Chris Croner. He owns a company called SalesDrive. And we're going to get into SalesDrive in just a moment, but I really appreciate you being here, Chris. And let's talk about the characteristics of these people. Like, let's get into the nitty gritty of like the need for achievement, those type of things. Can you give us kind of a short laundry list of what we should look for?
Of course. So starting out, there are those non-teachable elements. We got started 20 years ago, really looking at everything that had been published academically, researching every bit of data, in terms of what is it that makes an effective salesperson over the last, 85, almost 90 years now. And then looking at our own work, doing behavioral interviews with sales candidates, circling back with their managers after that to find out who really does become successful. And again, we distilled those 3 non-teachable characteristics. Number 1, again, need for achievement. As I mentioned, that person who wants to do well for the sake of doing well, who's again constantly focused on exceeding expectations. They're constantly thinking about what can I do to surpass what I did last month. There's sort of that entrepreneur mindset, if you will. Number 2, competitiveness. The person who wants to do 2 things. Number 1, as we mentioned, they want to be the best in their team. They're always comparing their performance to their peers. They need to know how they stand. But number 2, they want to win that client or that customer over to their point of view. Because to them, psychologically, that sale is kind of like a contest of wills. And then the third piece, optimism. The person who is certain that they will succeed. And of course, they're resilient when they face the inevitable rejection that a salesperson just has to deal with. It's those 3 characteristics all together, Doug: need for achievement, competitiveness, and optimism, that psychologically we describe as the perfect storm, if you will. And collectively, we refer to those 3 characteristics as drive.
And they play win-win though, right? I mean, they just don't slam bodies into the sales process just to get them in there. They really look at, is this the best thing as well for the client as it is for us in the process?
Oh, of course. Again, that's that need for achievement. We want to make sure that, again, when the salesperson is thinking about what am I going to deliver to this client, they've got that A mentality, A player mentality, A student mentality with that need for achievement, because they know that their reputation is always on the line. So because they know that, that's sort of the stick as well as the carrot, if you will, that kind of can motivate them.
Well, and I can vouch for that, because I'm that type of person, right? Where the reputation was always important. Where I'd be out there, like one company, I was out selling all 9 salespeople on my team combined every single month, over and over and over and over. Mm-hmm. And I remember my sales manager at the time called me in. His name was David, and he said, "Shut the door." I said, "What's up?" He goes, "What is wrong with you?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He goes, "You never get excited about anything." I'm like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Look at your numbers. Look at this team. You're out selling 3 teams of 9 this month combined." Mm-hmm. He said, "And you don't get excited. What's the point?" Mm-hmm. It was always about the recognition more so than the actual money for me. Mm-hmm. And then, so, he just kept pressing me. And I said, "David, I'll get excited when the check clears." Right? Right? Because then I can go home to my wife and my children and say, "Hey, we can do this and this and this and that." And that's more important to me than actually having my name, touted around this office. I already know that's happening anyways, right?
Yes.
I mean, when the CEO of a $300 million company calls you out of the blue and goes, "Hey, I appreciate what you're doing," you already know they're being talked about. But that call from that CEO is as important to me as anything else.
Absolutely.
And we all like it when we sell something. I mean, it's like a high. It's like a natural, like oxytocin or something, right? That I don't even know if that happens, but I just know that it feels that way, that it's coming through. So those 3 characteristics are spot on. It makes really a lot of sense to me. And well, I want to you have an assessment. Mm-hmm. So I want to bring that forth for people and tell people about the assessment because it's really cool.
Of course, we have an online assessment called the Drive Test. And the purpose of the Drive Test is to identify candidates who have those non-teachable characteristics, essentially, again, for particularly hunter salespeople, the ones that need to focus on new account acquisition. And we focus on that role simply because we find that is, you probably won't be surprised, but the number one position that most companies have the greatest degree of difficulty hiring for. Because of course, candidates can be very skillful at portraying themselves very well in the interview, but that becomes your greatest enemy because the person then comes on board and you're left asking, wait a minute, what happened to the person whom I interviewed? That was the best sale that I ever really saw out of them. So we set out again to focus on identifying those key characteristics and then designing an assessment to go after them. And there are really two key differentiators with our assessment. There are many great tests out there. Number one, though, we're the only assessment that goes after drive, need for achievement, competitiveness, and optimism. It's literally our patented model. But number two, the assessment is put together a little bit differently than many other tests. That's one of the questions we often get is, well, how do you derive these characteristics? What do you ask to determine whether someone has these traits? And could you just fake that test if you were a candidate? Well, the other key distinction is we design it so that it's eliminating faking. Specifically, we have a question format we use called forced choice. So for each question on the drive test, the candidate gets a series of 3 statements, all of which are worded very positively. So a question, for example, may say something like, I consider myself a great leader. I have strong relationship skills. I'm very motivated. Okay, now which of these is most like you and which one is least like you? So that, as you can imagine, really forces that candidate to make some very difficult distinctions. But then it gives us a much better sense of their real priorities. And as they're working their way through the assessment, of course, we're constantly monitoring their consistency as they respond to those questions, because as you can imagine, if they do try to fake the test, it's going to be very difficult for them to remember consistently what they ranked most and least across the entire assessment. So again, it's designed to be very robust for you in that regard. We've given over 100,000 assessments today, worked at close to, 1,400 companies around the world. It's always our pleasure to be of service, but we measure all those non-teachable characteristics and then the teachables as well. Confidence, persuasiveness, relationship skills, organizational skills, all of those we measure at the same time.
It's really cool. So let's talk about interviews for a second, because I know interviews, a lot of people rely upon interviews. And, and I'll just say it for the record. Those of you who are listening, those resumes are full of lies. Just so, I mean, I always take a resume and I challenge the person with the resume, right? To really drill down into it, instituted $40 million in sales. It sounds like a big deal, right? Then when you start driving into it, it's like, okay, so tell me about what you had. Well, we had a bunch of people. How many people do you have in your division? 40. Okay. And what are they selling on, average? Oh, $1 million, right? So 1 million times 40 sounds impressive, right? In a year. Then I go, well, what's their quota? Oh, they sold $1 million. Yeah. What's their quota? They sold $1 million. Like, yeah. And I got the answer. What is their quota? 1.3 million, right?
Yep. So
let me guess, you're under quota, but you're reporting this as a pinnacle of success. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep.
So I'm a big proponent, because when all the statistics I look at, Chris, they basically say about 12% you can rely upon. If you're hiring just off an interview, you're probably going to be right 12% of the time. Mm-hmm. When you add assessments, it significantly goes up when you add the right assessments. Yes. Right. So there's other assessments, and people are out there hiring off of, DISC or, other, and it's like, no, that's a personality assessment. That's not indicative of whether or not they have drive or they're willing to sell or not. Right. Mm-hmm. So do you find that, in all of the 1,400 plus companies, you've worked with, do you find that, like, I don't find interviews very structured most of the time. I find most of them are just haphazard and random. Yes.
Very true. That's very, very true. Particularly when someone's just getting started interviewing, they're doing the best they can. So they're sitting down with that candidate thinking, okay, how am I going to determine whether this person is going to succeed for me? Well, they'll do their best to look at the person's track record as it is presented to them, as you indicated, which could be many different ways on the resume, which is typically lying. Or in many cases lying, and then they'll sit down with the person and ask them just about generic things about what they did on the flight in or their weekend, or they'll ask them to sell them a pencil. They're doing the best they can to determine whether this person has these nebulous characteristics like gift of gab and things like this, and that to determine whether they're going to be successful. Whereas we know the best predictor of future behavior is previous behavior. So during the interview, we want to ask the candidate about behaviors they've engaged in at work that reflect the characteristics that we would like for them to show for us going forward. So when we identify, for example, drive is an important characteristic, we want somebody who's going to be a successful hunter. We want to look at the 3 elements of drive. So starting out with need for achievement. One of my favorite questions to ask is, tell me about the greatest goal you've ever accomplished professionally. Really have the person describe it and flesh it out for you. Then you can stop and reflect back to that person. You've got to be proud of that. How do you intend to top it? Again, the person high in need for achievement has a plan to top it, and they're excited about the opportunity to tell you about it. Or what kinds of sacrifices have you had to make to be successful? What does that person consider to be a sacrifice? Was it maybe they had to work a couple weekends last year? Or was it something more substantial? Now compare that to the kinds of sacrifices you've seen your top performers have to make over time. So just looking at those behavioral questions, looking at the things the person has consistently done in the past that reflected the characteristics that we would like for them to show for us going forward. And then when we review their resume with them, there are certain techniques that we can use, of course, to make sure that we're getting the truth out of that resume. Happy to share those as well.
That's an excellent set of questions, actually. And so if you have structured questions in an interview, not you, but your candidate, your clients have a structured interview, now you can point score these things, right? So a lot of people, they don't do that. They'll lead score a lead, but they won't lead score their candidates. Like what?
Yes.
So those questions are awesome too, because if a person's not going to, like, let's say they give you a 1 or 2, like, yeah, I did this, that, and it's like, boom. Well, you can almost assume they lack empathy, because they're not willing to actually open up and talk about these things. So there's different things that would come out of this. I'm going to plug your book again, if you don't mind, because it's called Never Hire a Bad Salesperson Again. It's by Dr. Christopher Croner, 2nd edition. If you can read it, I've got the thing here. Go out and get this book. Check it out. It's a really good book. How do they take the test? Is it salesdrivetest.net or .com or where is it?
SalesDrive.info. And there's a big red button on the upper right-hand side for a sample assessment. We're delighted to provide a complimentary assessment to each of your listeners that has a company and wants to test it out. It's our pleasure to be of service.
So it's a complimentary thing, which means free.
Correct.
All right. Well, you heard it here, folks, on the CEO Sales Strategy Podcast. We're talking with Dr. Christopher Croner, owns a company called SalesDrive, and it's a really great conversation. In your book, when first thing I opened it up, it had something that said 5 steps to hiring top salespeople. It was right here, right? People ask me all the time, where do I start? Like, whether I'm a seasoned company and I'm just not doing it the way I want to do it. I want to do it better, or I'm kind of new at this. Where do I start? So what would you tell them?
It all really comes down to looking at your sourcing. Sourcing is so important. And it's an element that most people don't think about. How do we find candidates? What characteristics do we look for in, say, a resume or a LinkedIn profile? And at the same time, when we're looking at candidates who are coming to us, how do we write our job ad to make sure that it's reflecting high drive? What words can we use? And we talk about that in the book. How do you put together a job ad? How do you source candidates at the very top of that funnel? What can you look for? So for example, when it comes to something like a resume or a LinkedIn profile, there are many characteristics that you can find in those types of sources that can indicate the person is high potential drive. We've had some clients who almost every single candidate they assess when they purchase an assessment is high in drive. And so we've asked them, we've interviewed them, what are you looking for? What's so consistently predicting those high drive scores? And they said, well, they really look for 3 different things in a candidate. Number 1, they look for the person, of course, who's more of a passive candidate than an active candidate. Of course, the person's been actively out there looking in the world of sales for a while. There can be a good reason for it. Number 2, they look for the person that is not a job hopper, so they have some longevity in the positions they've held. And number 3, they look for the person that's able to provide some sort of metrics to show that they have been successful previously. They find those 3 things together, though it's not a perfect correlation, they do tend to predict, a higher overall drive score. But then a company might ask, well, I'm looking for somebody, for example, I'm a younger company. I need somebody who's going to hit the ground running, if you will, start producing relatively quickly. What should I look for in that regard? Well, of course, at that point, looking for the person that has a track record, not just at a large company, which can be very tempting. We often see a candidate with a track record at a very large company, and the thought is, okay, this person has done very well at this very large company. Surely they're going to bring that same degree of success to bear for us, because surely they must have had world-class sales training. But the key question in that regard, of course, Doug, is what really led to that person's success? Right. Was it their own effort, or was it really the fact that they had all that brand recognition and collateral material that were opening the doors for them, if you will? So finding the person that has had 2 to 3 years of relevant previous experience at a similarly sized company, as well as an overall drive score of a 4 or a 5 on the assessment, that does strongly tend to predict the person has the knowledge to succeed, and they have the passion to execute on that knowledge, if you will.
Makes sense. What about somebody that doesn't have the sales knowledge, they're new, right?
Mhm.
But we're looking at bringing them into the company. Let's just say, for example, because a lot of people think that a predictor of success is industry experience. And in some cases it's true. And in many cases, I found it not really to be. But when we're looking at somebody who's brand new, they want to get into sales, how can we identify, I know those three characteristics, but how does somebody like approach this in the capacity of saying, okay, I've got these 15 people here that none of them have sales experience, but I want to find out, do they have these characteristics?
Of course, that's really the first step is the assessment. We've had some clients will take a subscription to the Sales Drive assessment, and they'll use it at job fairs for kids just out of school to determine, do they have, they may not have even thought about going into a career in sales, but they'll have those indicators, those three non-teachable indicators. And now we can bring that person into the interview and begin to dig into those. Of course, many behavioral questions will in many cases rely upon the person having previous sales experience, but there are other ones that you can ask that don't require sales experience at all. For example, if you want to look for the person who's persuasive, tell me about what's helpful to you to get somebody to change their mind, if you will. And of course, if someone tells you at that point, well, what's helpful to me to get someone to change their mind, I like to give them all the facts. And when I give them all the facts, surely they'll make the right decision at that point. Whereas someone who says, well, what's important to me to get someone to change their mind is to find out what's really most important to that person and structure my argument around what's most important to them. Of course, that indicates the person has that kind of natural persuasive ability. Keeping in mind, of course, we can teach that. So again, for need for achievement, competitiveness, and optimism, the non-teachable side, for something like optimism, tell me about a time when you remained persistent at work, maybe persistent in school, even though everyone else around you gave up. Right. Now tell me about another time, because when you're asking for someone who's going to be effective as a hunter, you're really looking for the person, Doug, that is going to be able to go out, whether that's over the phone when it's inside sales or outside when it's outside sales, knock on a door, sometimes get that door slammed in their face, then knock on that next door with that much more certainty and passion and conviction. And when you think about it psychologically, that's a very special person that we're talking about.
Right.
So it's all about asking the right series of questions for that person's level of experience to ferret those characteristics out.
So we're really looking to hire for profile. And if experience is there, then it's a plus, potentially. Mm-hmm. We got to test that too. I remember one guy we hired one time. He was fantastic. He was a bungee jumper. That was like his big thing. And when I first was thinking about this, I was like, that takes courage or craziness. I'm not really sure. You get up on the side of a bridge and just off you go, right? So it takes courage. But then when I started looking deeper and deeper, I just wrote down some characteristics. He was the president of the chess club. Mm-hmm. He was valedictorian for his class. He had a 4th degree black belt in Aikido. Mm-hmm. And he won many performance awards for music and things like that. A lot of people would just dismiss that guy because they'd be like, oh, he has no sales experience, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what we're talking about is that's a guy you probably want to actually assess and figure out whether or not that person actually has the ability to be a top performer in sales. Because what I know from training people in sales for multiple decades now is I've taken CPAs who have no sales experience whatsoever and turned them into top producers because they had this profile.
Mm-hmm.
So
very, very true.
So
very true. So when you get people who, again, have backgrounds that are very eclectic, you gave a great example. You're talking about somebody there that's very seeking of new sensations, that very much enjoys accomplishment and achievement. Yes. So bringing a person like that on board that has those motivators, that's wonderful. But just setting expectations. Okay, the person's going to need some sales 101. So setting the proper expectations in terms of when that person is going to be successful. I would much rather, if I had the opportunity and I had the opportunity to train someone over time, I'd much rather bring somebody in like that than someone who has sometimes 30 years of sales experience, but lacks the drive. The person who can sell, but won't do it. Maybe they can, but will they? That's really the key distinction. So I'd much rather have somebody that, again, will do it, that has that desire to do well for its own sake, that I can kind of give them that information and they will take that to the next level on their own, than the person that maybe has a world of experience, but won't do it, that's satisfied, that's looking to retire on the job, if you will.
Yeah, and that's a key critical component, because I remember I had a client. They are a major news network. I can't say their name because I was under non-disclosure, but I can say they have 3 letters and they're usually on channel 4, 5, or 7. I'll leave it at that, right? But that's what was happening. They had a sales team there. Those people had been there for 30 years and they could not figure out what was going on. It's like, I cannot get production any higher than it is whatsoever. Well, as you said in the beginning of this thing, they reached their saturation point. They're all near the end of their career. They're trying to sell like they did back in 1970. And today the game has changed. Yes. So, I mean, people are still people, but the communication modes are much different than they were in the past. And so what we ended up doing is exactly what you just said. We ended up looking at assessing the drive of these people, assessing all of these things across the board. And we realized about 70% of the team couldn't stay. Right. So then we could hire younger people, not that it has to be younger, they could be older. We could hire new people and we can bring them in with the right profile. And when we do, guess what? They're starting to make more sales. It's that simple.
Yep.
So the reason I bring that up, Chris, is because it's a testament to everything you're saying on this call. So if somebody's sitting there going, oh my gosh,
thank you.
This stuff works.
It's amazing because, again, in terms of when you ask someone what leads somebody, as I mentioned before, to be successful in sales, they're going to say all the classic things. The person who likes to persuade or who just likes people, things of that nature. They don't think about those non-teachable pieces, particularly that need for achievement, that quiet drive, if you will. Many companies will say, well, what I'm looking for in a candidate is somebody, say, for example, with a great athletic background in college, and that's going to be my key indicator. In many cases, that can be a great indicator of, say, competitiveness. But the key question is, what really led them to be successful in terms of their athletics? Was it their own effort, or was a coach waking them up every morning at 6 a.m., or were they up there on their own before the rest of the team practicing, if you will? Right. Sometimes you're better off getting that person who was, in the back of the cafe, peeling potatoes and working their way through college, if you will, kind of with that mentality, than somebody who was just an athlete in and of itself. Or look for the person who was the president of the fraternity or the sorority. Well, that's great, but I want to determine what really led to that behavior. What was really underneath that? What's really the heart of the person, if you will. And that's why we go after those non-teachables with our assessment.
It makes so much sense, because if their father, let's say, was the head coach and he kept rousting him out of bed or her out of bed every single morning to go to that particular sport, and they just happen to excel because of positioning, right, and some capacity, and they were a good athlete, but they just don't really have that drive within them. The same thing in sales. You're gonna, if you hire somebody like that in sales, you're going to be rousting them out of bed every single morning, right? So, So
because sales is different. It's really different than any other position. Psychologically, it's different. It requires a special type of person, as we mentioned. That person is going to be able to handle that rejection again and again. Then with that much more certainty and energy, knock on that next door. And because no other position really requires that, you need to add an assessment to the process that goes after those non-teachables, if you will.
Yeah, and I piggybacking on that, I can tell people when you had said need for achievement, right? If somebody doesn't have need for achievement, you can almost guarantee they're not going to close in situations that could have been closed, even if it's a win-win play, because their empathy will be so high and their lack of need of achievement will be so low that they're just going to walk away from a sale. Or they'll say things like, oh, I remember this happened. I was shadowing, company asked me to look for their sales team, and it was a real estate company. We were shadowing the real estate, and I'm standing there, and this husband and wife are going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It's like a $4+ million house. And she's going, honey, I love this house. This is amazing. Look, the little ones can hear. We have the pool out here. We could do this. He goes, I don't know. It's $4+ million. They could afford it. The numbers were there. It was easy. And she says something like, well, hon, you know what? The kids are older now. I can go back to the law firm and I can actually get a job, and I can, take some of the pressure off you. What do you think? He goes, that's a great idea, but it's a lot of money, and they go back and forth for a few times. And so she says, well, I just think how happy we'll be here. He goes, I really think we would be happy here. He says, I'm not sure. Sure as heck, the real estate agent says this, you guys probably ought to take some time and think this over. Right? Because this is a really important decision. It's a lifetime commitment, basically, of what you're doing on this property. And, you're really not sure. So why don't you take some time, think it over, get back to me in a couple of days. Well, they did get back to her in a couple of days. Right? And she goes, well, what'd you guys think? Yeah, we decided not to take the house. Oh, okay. I'll show you some new houses. No, we don't need to. Well, what do you mean? The house that's 2 blocks around the corner, literally, $5.3 million we purchased it. I'm like, as soon as I heard her say, take some time, I want to honestly kick her in the leg, right? Because it was like, stop, because she doesn't have that need for achievement, what you're talking about, Chris. So she just lets them go, even when this house was perfect for them.
Yes. And again, when we think about that behavior, that distinction between people who are successful and not, salespeople who are successful and those that are not, those behaviors during the call, you can teach those. You can teach someone to be perceptive. You can teach someone to listen effectively. You can teach someone to have that emotional intelligence, versus IQ. Emotional intelligence is something that is teachable. When they do have that need for achievement, they're like a sponge. If they're on their first call and they make those mistakes will haunt them, if you will. They'll want to do better. They'll use that as an example to compel themselves to learn more and do better. But if the person is low in need for achievement and they make those mistakes, just as you said, oh, well, let's go on to the next one. It's not as big of a deal. So when you find that person, that person that wants to get an A, if you will, that's the key. I want to see that person that in that situation, okay, great, but they're haunted by it. They want to do better. They're going to use that example it's just going to bother them until they figure out, okay, what should I have done? Let's replay that now. And how can I make an adjustment now on the next call?
So when I was in studying martial arts, I was around a lot of people from Asian descent, and they used to tell me that an A- is not acceptable. Mm-hmm. It was like, and I used to ask them, and I say, well, why? And they say, well, our parents held us at a very high standard, right? Mm-hmm. But every once in a while, it was that person that an A is not acceptable. The A+ is only acceptable. Mm-hmm. And so that's the type of characteristic that we're looking for, because the parents aren't driving them at that point. They're driving themselves to be at the top of the top of the top.
Exactly. And again, past the age of about 21, 22. That's relatively solidified, if you will. So finding that person, again, when you have the opportunity, particularly if you're looking for people that don't necessarily have sales experience, and you find that person that has that need for achievement, and add that to competitiveness and optimism, that's the person that kind of run through walls for you, if you will. Just make sure you give them that training.
Sounds great. Chris, I really appreciate you being here. Is there anything you were hoping I hope Doug maybe asked me this question and I didn't, and we could cover it now, or did I get them all?
Yeah, you hit the major one. Sometimes people will ask us, when we talk about a resume, and that people can sometimes lie in the resume. Is there anything that we can do when we're reviewing a resume with that person to help to really kind of get the truth, to understand more about their psychology? And of course, you can go into every accomplishment that they list, but one of the things that's most interesting sometimes about a resume is what it shows us about that person's decision-making style. Because when they're out there working for us as a salesperson, we have to make sure that they're prioritizing their day, for example, effectively. We have to understand what's really making them tick. And what I'll typically recommend doing as they're reviewing a resume with a candidate is ask that candidate 3 questions for each position they've held. Number 1, of course, give me the basic job description. What did you do in that role? Number 2, if you were on a sales team, where did you rank on the team? Of course, the competitive person will know exactly where they ranked. And number 3, what caused you to move on to the next position? What got you to make that change to that next role? And of course, because people tend to embellish a little bit on resumes, and as they're describing them, I'm sure you've heard over the years, people will give you answers like, we might consider to be guarded answers. Things like, oh, there were some misunderstandings with my supervisor. There were some differences of opinion concerning my salary, things like that. Right. If you start to hear those guarded answers, one of the most powerful techniques you can use is what we talk about in the book, the magic wand question. Okay, if we had, say, a magic wand, and we could change 3 things about that job so you would have never wanted to leave, what would those 3 things be? And of course, that's when you start to get a kernel of the truth. Oh, let's see, my assistant wouldn't have quit. I would have gotten paid more. I wouldn't have yelled at the sales VP. They give you something you can start to dig in on. And then at that point, the key is to find out whether there are other examples of that behavior emerging again in the past, because the more consistent example of a behavior like that we can find in the past, the more reliably we can predict it will emerge for us going forward. So that magic wand question takes a potentially very difficult question, and it reframes it in a very positive way, if you will, allowing you to get much more of the straight story behind that candidate.
Those of you who just didn't hear what he just said, dig in on these things, because here's the thing. You're so accurate on these assessments, and not your assessment per se, that's accurate, but what you teach is so spot on. Because look, if somebody says, I just left because of, wasn't the right fit or whatever. Okay, but was it them, or was it wasn't a right fit, right? And so as you're teaching people, dig in, because if you don't dig in, guess what? They could come to your organization and be disruptive, just like they were to that previous organization. They may have got fired, and they'll spin it in that interview. So what you're saying is so spot on. So thank you for bringing it forward.
Thank you.
All right. So Chris, thanks for being on the CEO Sales Strategies podcast today. I really appreciate it. Once again, guys, I'm going to recommend you go out and get Dr. Christopher Croner's book. It's called Never Hire a Bad Salesperson Again. And, stop by at SalesDrive and check it out. Do your complimentary assessment. You'll probably learn some stuff about yourself and certainly people in your organization, that's for sure. Chris, thanks again for being here, sir.
Thank you so much, Doug. It's a pleasure to be of service. Thank you.
Hey, that was full of a lot of wonderful stuff, huh? Now, here's the thing. If you're going to hire top A producers, you've got to be a top A producing company. What does that mean? You got to set yourself up. You got to let people know. If you have deficiencies, they want to know. But you've got to have training. You got to have onboarding. You got to have all these things. Don't expect that top producers are going to come in there and just make this up. They will make it up, but it may not be in alignment with what you want for your company. Or more likely, about 7 out of 10 of them are going to just walk out the door within the first 30 to 60 days. Therefore, you're going to have a high cost of turnover. It is expensive to hire these type of people. It's expensive to hire anyone. So make sure that you're doing this in the arena, in the area, and in the structure that is laid out in Chris's book or any teachings that I have given you as well. If you like this type of content, you want to hear more of this, or you want to hear different types of content, reach out to me at doug@ceosalesstrategies.com. Let me know what you want specifically. We may already have the talent in queue, or we may have to go out and source that talent, but be happy to do that. If you like this podcast, give it a 5-star review, subscribe to it if you haven't already, and share it with your friends. The more you do that, the more the podcast grows, the more people get helped. When it comes to hiring people, make sure you're using assessments. If you don't use assessments, I'm going to tell you that the probability of success will be lower, and use the right ones. Sales-specific assessments, not personality assessments. Interviews and resumes can be embellished upon and, quite frankly, faked. So if you're just relying upon those alone, you're probably going to have a low probability of success. Statistics show about 12% probability, especially if you don't have a structured interview. So that's it. If you want help in getting your people to the top 1% of sales globally, reach out to me. I'm the guy who can help you. If you want help in growing your revenue, getting your company in order, reach out. I'm the guy who can help you. Once again, this is Doug C. Brown, the CEO Sales Strategy Podcast. Thanking you for being here. My email is doug@ceosalesstrategies.com. LinkedIn is Doug Brown 123. Phone number at the company is 603-595-0303. Go out, sell a lot of stuff, sell it profitably, make someone happy, and be happy yourself. To your success.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the CEO Sales Strategies Podcast. What is something that you learned that you could act on today? Don't forget to schedule it now, or it may never get forward momentum. If you find our content valuable, please leave a favorable review and let us know what you liked. Please also share this with others if the content will help them. For our show notes, other episodes, and more interesting content and resources, please visit ceosalesstrategiespodcast.com. See you soon, and to your continued success,